Welcome to another episode of Tales and Tactics, Rules as Written. This is our show that gives tabletop games the book club treatment. Join us as we dive deep into games you know or may never have heard of. Sometimes gems that just haven't been given the attention that they deserve. I'm your host, Troy. With me, my co-host, Max. And of course, behind the scenes, our producer, Jay. Today's episode is about the second edition of Lasalle. Lines, squares, the momentum of battle. And this second edition definitely deserves your attention.
Yeah, so we haven't done a Napoleonic game yet.
That's right. This makes us legit wargamers now.
This is the real stuff.
100%.
This is where all the stereotypes come from.
Yeah, this is where the term grognard comes from, you know, and I'm saying it with the English pronunciation there on purpose, but yeah, right? So this is the second edition of the divisional level Napoleonic tactics game. So you may be familiar with like tactics games being like platoon level when you're thinking about like World War II, right? Like almost skirmish games. But when you're dealing at a Napoleonic level, we're seeing the maneuvers of battalions in this game, right? As our base level, as our base unit of maneuver, infantry battalions or cavalry regiments. So it's like very important to recognize that that is a tactical level at this period of warfare because these base elements are doing a lot of the core maneuver. They're not subdividing out into smaller elements aside from perhaps their skirmish screens. But we'll talk about how that works in Lasalle because that's something that's very interesting, but also a point of contention with this rule set with some of the discussion I've seen around it. But to dive in, this is the second edition published by Sam Mustafa by Honor Games. This, again, is a tactical Napoleonic rule set. It is the second edition following the original game that came out back in 2009. This original release was seen as quite a revolution because it broke a lot of conventions as to Napoleonic thinking in terms of war games. The way there are penalties for open flanks, the way there are requirements for certain supporting ranges, a lot of that was modified, changed, or abandoned to suit a different play style. Now, when we come forward to Lasalle's second edition, it's 2021. This is the second time we've seen this title. It's pretty much completely rewritten. It is still a divisional level Napoleonics game, but the turn sequence is much more dynamic now as you're going back and forth by spending your currency or momentum. So we'll talk more about this turn order here, but this is a companion game in many ways to the title Blucher, also a game by Sam, the same designer, and that is a much larger scale army level command game where you're moving around complete brigades. That is the game where you are, you know, the commander-in-chief. You're Napoleon, right? While in Lasalle, you're a divisional commander. You're in charge of, you know, maybe a wing or a significant element of the battle, but you're not a corps commander. You're not the army commander. You're not running the show. You have a specific place in the battlefield where you're the most senior commander, and everything in that little slice of the battle is yours. And that's kind of the way to look at this game.
And in terms of Napoleonics, we're talking about, you know, the triangle of infantry, cavalry, artillery.
That's right. We're talking about like the late 1790s through to 1815.
Again, with a game like Blucher, that's closer to your sort of Kriegspiel comparison, whereas this is a little bit more zoomed in on that.
This has more of that, I mean, it's still elegant, but it has more of a detailed feel.
Okay.
Because your battalion formations are going to really define their performance and behavior in the game. So the way to think about this game is you're a divisional commander with multiple brigades under you, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, exactly as you said, Max. Now, this gets to the point of why it's as abstract as it is in some regards, because you are not a brigadier and you are not a colonel. So you're not controlling a brigade or a battalion. You're not as close to the action in some regards. You're still on a horse at the battlefield, of course, right? We're dealing with the horse and musket era. But what I'm saying is that when this game, Lasalle, chooses to abstract things, it's doing so in a way as to emphasize your focus in the role of that commander. Skirmishing in this game is really abstract relative to the tradition of Napoleonic battle games. What you're familiar with in many games, so General d'Armée, that's the first one that comes to mind. I'm kind of blanking, but there's many other games, Black Powder is another one, that will have dedicated skirmisher bases of troops. So to give a little background, a unit is 4 bases of troops, whether they're cavalry in formation or infantry in line or block, right, or column. They're 4 component bases, regardless of the number of historical companies that may or historically may not have made up a battalion. It's just 4 pieces for our convenience, right? But when you were to look at many other Napoleonic games, there's this releasing of skirmish screens, these other bases that may be drawn from the other formations or just, bought with points on their own, right, a la Black Powder, and placed out in front. And those are like separate dudes who operate as basically like skirmishers, right? And acting as a screen.
Mm-hmm.
But you are commanding now irregular bands of troops at the same time as you're controlling 500 plus individual battalion formations. So there starts to become a rules disconnect between the handling of these 2 very different scales of characters. Some games have a more elegant way of dealing with this than others, and it has always been something that has been a matter of preference in the wargaming world of Napoleonics. There's never been a one ring to rule them all rule set per se, because no one can ultimately agree on how to represent some of the key fundamental challenging aspects of this period, and this being a main one. How Lasalle does it is your battalions do not release skirmish screens, and you do not have an independent skirmish screen that you place models from. Your battalions are rated in their skirmish rating, which contributes a numerical value to your overall score. Then you roll a number of dice equal to that. So it's a bucket of dice usually. It could be 22 dice. It's kind of crazy sometimes. And 6s are hits. You compare your skirmish screen's hits with your opponent's skirmish screen hits. Net difference, whoever has that gets the advantage for this turn and goes first, or chooses whether to go first or not. And then secondly, if you win by increments of 2 points or more, that's an additional momentum point, which is your orders currency. So you're not using skirmishers to specifically harass a unit and snipe them. You're not using skirmishers to get into an orchard to make that untenable on a flank for a light battalion. What you're doing is you're influencing the overall momentum and direction of the game on a turn-by-turn basis. Who's going first and who's going with what amount of additional orders. And in a way, as a divisional commander, would you truly know the disposition of your skirmish screen in such an intimate way? I mean, you'd for sure know them, and you'd know their positionings relative to your brigades. But are you really going to know, oh, no, my skirmish screen has lost 2 of its 5 bases, so they're at this percentage. And therefore, is that the kind of thing that you're going to get in a missive or a dispatch back to you later that day? Or is that something that you're going to know in the moment? And I feel like the distinction in Lasalle here is that you make the abstraction because the guy you're representing doesn't necessarily have that direct intel or information. So they're more using what they glean from it. We don't see the specific skirmishers, but we know the net outcome of their behavior and performance, and then we can act on that.
Right. So there's a specific POV for this battle. And rather than say an omniscient view, which would be, I guess, more typical of a traditional war game.
Well, many war games will make you be a captain and a colonel and a general all at once. And they'll never have a distinction as you do everything. I mean, in many regards, there's no one else to push the models around. So you're everybody. But at the same time, when you lose the focus of a role in a war game, who do you represent? it can dilute the game. And I think it's a cool choice to center yourself so specifically in the divisional seat in this game. Or you can play at core level as well, like you can scale it. But that to me is really interesting. However, I will say that is such a big fundamental abstraction that it can lead to, one, you having a whole pile of skirmisher models you never use. But two, like there are very specific things that can happen because of the presence of skirmishers that this may not represent or account for. You know, like maybe the presence of Sharp and his rifles on the flank does mean something more than just like an extra order this turn. You know what I'm trying to say?
Right.
And not to sell this game short, there is an appendix in the back that has a special rule to incorporate a more detailed skirmishing system if that is something you want to import to this. But that is something that kind of underscores this game, is that there are smart abstractions made at different levels that don't detract or take away, but in fact emphasize where your, I guess, role, we'll say again, would be. So you generate momentum in the turn and you spend this. As you spend your heartbeat or your MO, you effectively, you can trigger different abilities. So what this does is these are the different orders that your guys can go on. It'll be movement. It can involve combat, a variety of things. But when you do these orders, it'll cost you different numbers of momentum. And when you trigger your momentum order, it may also allow your opponent to then interrupt, steal the turn sequence, and start spending momentum of their own. So it's a dynamic seesaw, as I can spend momentum to activate formations or the global overall force to do certain actions. So like if I'm rallying or moving, I can only do that to a specific formation. But if I'm going to shoot or perhaps change formation, I could do that with everybody that's eligible. But if I'm within proximity to the opposition, and this game doesn't use inches, it uses base width measurements. So if you're within 4 base widths, so that's for many tables, that's 8 inches, it's going to actually, in fact, trigger them stealing the turn if they choose to do so. So like if I get close to you and I do a volley sequence, that can always be interrupted. And that doesn't mean it comes before my volley, but it means now you can take the initiative and start spending your own MO.
Okay. So the abstraction, just to jump back to the controversial part of this.
Yes.
So the idea of a skirmish line or a break off of skirmishers from a line is more treated as an effect rather than a unit. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, that's precisely right.
Okay.
It's a mechanical implication and impact on the game system. It is not a unit. Even with the expanded skirmisher rules, there are more markers that you place, you know, like status effects, than they are like a unit. Like General d'Armée, it's like the brigade skirmish screen is a unit that has health and behavior. In this, it is not so. It is abstracted into a cloud that exists on the table where it needs to be doing its job underneath you, maybe not as well as you want, or maybe spectacularly well. But we do have to ask ourselves the two questions of, is this a detailed enough representation for a tactical game, right? And secondly, is rolling 22 dice at the start of every turn fun? Like that's a huge whack load of dice to count out and find the sixes in. Like it doesn't feel wrong, but it feels like the messiest part of the game in some regards. So I can understand why this is a sore point for some Napoleonic gamers, because they feel like this is where this game can maybe be more of a game than a simulation. And the Napoleonic community has very traditionally leaned towards simulation.
That's the stereotype for sure. And there are definitely a lot of examples to that your Napoleonic gamer is very detail oriented, I guess.
They're counting the buttons on the brigadier's vest. They want to know the shape of the shako on the grenadier's head, you know? They got to know these things.
Mm-hmm.
And they want to say the name of the French cavalry right, and I'm not going to even try. I'm avoiding it. In this whole episode, I'm going to deliberately walk around that.
Yeah, I would say on the face of it, it sounds a little gamist. That doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't fun, but I guess for those whose expectation is that this is going to be representational of actual Napoleonic combat as recorded, are going to find a different experience because this game is leaning into the idea of it as understood or experienced from the commander's point of view. Am I correct in kind of saying that?
That's interesting. That's a good way to place it because it's very focused on command. It's very focused on being able to process the friction, degrading your order efficiency to get the most out of your troops and the most out of your interrupts. Mm-hmm. So, like, for example, you don't pay a penalty for moving through rough terrain by losing 2 inches or moving at half speed. It costs 1 extra momentum to trigger that order. So it's the command penalty you're paying. You're not paying it's assumed that your battalion commanders and company commanders are navigating their troops. They're handling that. You are more dealing with the fact that it's harder for you to get your messenger to them in that dense terrain and that they have to follow these paths through the trees. It's not like, oh man, we got to walk past all these trees and I keep tripping on all the logs. It's more like it's kind of a narrow road. So it's kind of hard to file through. And that's what's hard about it. Mm-hmm. The way that it contextualizes the challenge continually puts it on the command decision, though it is a relatively simple currency in that it's just momentum points that you spend to activate groups of a brigade or the whole brigade if it's all within 4 base widths, or the global order, like I mentioned, where you can trigger off things like a volley or a formation change. And it's another thing to note, this game doesn't have like timed behaviors. So in many other Napoleonic titles, not just to make this a comparison game, but like you'll get charged by cavalry and you'll have to perform a troop quality test to see if your infantry forms square. And what that would mean is they pull in their companies, they call in their skirmishers, and they form up like a four directional square, obviously, but facing out of 4 sides. It's not a very good shooting formation, but effectively cavalry can't do a lot to it in many regards. And it's really hard to motivate a horse to charge it.
Right. Yeah. It's a bit like a very tight pinwheel shape.
Yeah, very much. And so check this out. You would expect in some titles, based on perhaps the heritage of Napoleonic gaming, that your battalions might be able to trigger that. However, in Lasalle, that is not the case. It is up to you to use your momentum to call interrupts, to make formation changes when the timing is right. It's up to you to wait on that and know, do I stay in line to get that last volley or do I go to square now? And you have to make those decisions. And now this is a point of contention again, because I've read different things that suggest that, in the line of battle, only the higher level officer would be able to tell a lower level command, like what they're doing with their battalion in such a way as to say, like, you can form square now. But the other thing I've read is said that would be specifically the battalion commander's call because they're the closest to the front and it would be their job to preserve the unit. So it's like, I've read both. And I'm not sure, I bet you there is a definitive answer from someone who is more well-read because I'm still learning this period, like absolutely I am. Mm-hmm. But it's really interesting that you can't just get square because your guys are veterans and they're good at doing that.
Right.
You have to know based on the flow of momentum when to call that. And again, that might be more gamist in a sense because maybe a veteran formation could form square, right? But it's putting that pressure again on your command resource and your ability to do this. And then you do have something as well that's sort of like the ultimate command resource called your intervention. And that's when you can place your general down. And it's sort of abstract, like they're not really going there, sort of. I mean, they kind of are. But it's more that they're like, this is the focus. And it can do an emergency formation change. So this allows you to pop square if you waited too long. Or in the advanced rules, if you're playing with linear armies, so think the British or the Portuguese or something, they can actually get an extra volley by deploying. Instead of taking the formation change, they can take an extra round of shooting
Oh, okay.
like thin red line style. So there's lots of like wrinkles to this, but the fundamental process is I'm spending momentum points and you're watching for the moment that I'm close enough as to you stealing it back. And then you spend momentum points. And if you just move cavalry in the back line, like make a lateral move, or if you fire cannons from the rear, I can't interrupt that. But as soon as you start to do stuff in proximity to me, then the interrupt becomes my decision. So there's this rhythm that starts to develop. And it's like, who can play the drum beat better? And I think that's kind of cool for a game set in this time. But I will say that it is ultimately using simple resolutions. Like, to discuss how fire in combat works, it's like you shoot to put disruptions on somebody. And those are effectively like shock. They'll add up to the number of track a unit has to defeat it, to break the unit. And a unit will have anywhere from like 4 to 7, tracks, right?
Okay.
A unit can rally to remove these. And this is a really cool mechanic. If they pass the rally check, it removes the shock, obviously. If they fail the rally, you roll 1 per accumulated disruption, right? If you fail, that disruption converts into a loss and becomes a permanent damage marker on the unit that can no longer be rallied off in the battle.
Right. Interesting.
So there's this like risk reward to like, do I rally these guys now to take the heat off? Because if I don't, they could break on only disruptions, right? It's kind of more of a morale failure. Or it's like, do I rally now and risk accumulating actual losses on the unit, but I know it can hang because it doesn't have as many points overall against its total track, its total health, so to speak. Melee is much more decisive and can destroy units fast. So you have to be very careful when you trigger a melee, but it's not as deadly to attack as you think. It's actually, you're more likely to take losses on a defeat that you rout from. An attack that fails is more likely to wear you out than it is to result in you suffering a massive casualty rate or setback yourself, unless you're fighting cavalry. If you charge cavalry, they can wreck you back. But if you charge infantry and it fails, you basically take a disruption and retreat. Like you kind of see it's not working and pull back. So you don't really accumulate these massive, like, I charged you and then you wiped me. It doesn't really happen unless you are crazy enough to run light cavalry into the jaws of some heavy cavalry. The trick is that you're trying to be in the right formation as to not be in poor formation, to lose a ton of combat resolution points. And you're also trying to get the best one-on-one because you don't really get supports. Again, we're talking about a lot of Napoleonic traditions in gaming. A lot of times it's like you're within 4 inches of a flank, get a support die, right? Like if you have battalions near battalions, right? In Lasalle, there aren't these mystical bonus points, Those points might be really warranted and explained well in the rules that use them. But the example that Lasalle gives is, in this game, if you want your battalions to support each other, it's probably a good idea anyways. We don't need to give them a +1 for doing this. We just need to know that you've actually just protected your flank now. It's actually valuable to do that inherently, not because of some numeric modifier we assign to it to incentivize it even more, So it's like, there's cool logic that underscores this. And I really like how it works. Again, there's also no morale cascading. So there's no, like, this unit breaks and the 2 units to its left and right must now roll morale saves to see if they break. Like, that doesn't happen.
Right.
Also, squares can't move. This is something else. They're static. Arguably, squares not arguably, like they could move historically, but it's kind of like to root them defensively as a mechanic in a game. They can't move.
Right. So it's more like digging in a lot of ways.
It is. It's the equivalent of digging in this context for sure. So what are some questions you want to hit me with right now? Because I've kind of just laid out a lot of the core mechanics of this game.
Yeah. So I guess a lot of the strategy is built around the kind of economic expenditure of this momentum currency.
You're damn right.
And a lot of the what we would expect to be the sort of action reaction from like a traditional Napoleonic game is more based in this expenditure.
Yes.
At least as far as I can understand.
It's not based on unit to unit reaction. It's based more on the players choosing when to use these points at different intervals in the turn sequence.
Yeah. So I guess the idea is that as opposed to it feeling very like playing the front edge of the battle, you're playing more of like the abstraction of the back hat. Like it's almost, I'm almost guessing it feels more like pushing than pulling. That's a bad analogy, exactly.
But I do know what you mean, though, because you're not the sharp end, and you don't feel like you are.
Yeah, it's you're sort of loading orders and working on existing successes to sort of push forward further successes. As you push forward, that becomes riskier because then you end up reacting to your opponent. But yeah, I think I can see how the idea is to give the sense that it's sort of like with other war games where some of them give the sense that you're not fully in control, but this is an interesting way of doing it because it does that rather than necessarily using randomness, which it also does, obviously. It gives a sense of distance.
Yes.
By having it be this kind of pushing action where you're like putting stuff forward and then hopefully it doesn't get contested. Yeah,
because there's a wager to it where you're almost like calling a bluff on your opposition. Like, are you gonna steal this from me? Because if you don't, I'm gonna press. But if you do, is that you spending your valuable momentum on something you don't want to? Because you only have the momentum you have for the turn. So how much can I make you spend your points reacting to me as opposed to enacting your own battle plan, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because it's just this one stack of momentum, there'll be times where you'll want to pass and you'll go, I'm done because I have to hold 2 momentum for when you shoot at me. I'm going to need a rally and I'm going to need a volley back. So I got to hold 2 momentum. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
it gives you incentive to consider your resource, not just as like, how fast can I slam all this out? You know, because like there are times where perhaps that is what you want. But there are many cases where, like I was playing a game with Jay and there were defenders on a hill. It was very like Spanish feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And these guys had to go up this like kind of just because of the hill I had. It was like a rocky little hill, right? And they were going up the hill. And just the timing of that first volley was devastating just because the guys had to advance. They had to get within that 8-inch base width, 4 base widths. And then as soon as they did, volley. And then I was spending momentum on rallies to try and get these troops back into line, back under orders, right? Because they had like taken 3 disruption out of 6, like right off the gate. So now my momentum is being not wasted, but being completely mitigated by the timing of of Jay's troops, right? The way he used his momentum. And like we were kind of playing like learning style cooperative, like what should we do for this side? What should we do for that side? Kind of like teaming it up. But it was really cool. And I really liked the challenge of that, of like when to read the expenditure of this resource and where you're going to use it. Like, am I going to take the risk and rally close to you? Am I going to, like, I guess I should say, when you're within 8 inches or 4 base widths, you also have movement limitations. You can't just move freely. You either have to disengage or move to engage. Like that's kind of it.
Right.
You can't really just like freewheel about in the face of the enemy.
Right. So it sounds like a lot of the strategy is trying to push as much as you can without overextending yourself, leaving yourself open to your opponent, who is, if acting more defensively, able to use more of their momentum when it's their turn to basically punch holes in your hubris.
100%.
That's what I'm getting from how you're describing it.
Yeah.
Is that it's more like all games are economics of some kind, but it's more of an economics, like more obviously economical in the sense that your movement and your ability to push forward, it's not that it's unlimited, but it builds on itself.
It does.
And it's more about when you pump the brakes than necessarily how you rush into the opponent.
Yeah.
It's interesting because, it's almost more about what not to do than about what you are doing, which would be something more like a traditional war game where I want to cut you off and move up to this point, or outflank you here as I move this other one in, whatever other unit it might be, or draw you into my artillery fire.
Right.
But you are trying to do all those things, but you're also doing them kind of like if you had like a little aerial, and every time you pushed it out, it became less accurate. And you're like, okay, I just have to stop there. It's getting ridiculous.
Well, it's so interesting because like you have to play with this fog of war, not in terms of like what I can and cannot see on the table, because we can see everything basically, right? We're standing over top of it. It's little men. But it's more the fog of war of at what point do they begin their action and I lose mine? And you don't know. And the tension and friction of that is really satisfying. It's well implemented. I think it's something that encourages tactical play.
Mm-hmm.
It encourages you to be very smart about this resource. But some of the things, though, is like by taking out some of the more simulative or trigger-based aspects of a Napoleonic game, right? Where it's like, if this condition is met, this unit may do this or may receive this, if you know what I'm trying to say, right?
Yeah.
By taking that out, there are certain things you can achieve in this game that are not as historic as you might find in perhaps other games. Like you can get like multi-battalion attacks in ways that like perhaps we didn't really see, like multiple battalions from a brigade all crashing into one but defending battalion as like you converge your columns. Like there are certain things that like weren't really common or that are like war game things,
Mm-hmm.
that we can see like, oh, you're in a line, I get 2 columns, bang, I double battalion you, and now I have 16 dice to your 8, see you later.
Right.
It's like you can't do that in many games, but in Lasalle there is still the ability to do that if you can execute it. It's going to be hard. They're going to get momentum to spend to change it. So it's like the game doesn't say no to you. It's just harder to do the things that maybe are not as historical or maybe are more like artful in terms of generalship, perhaps, to use a silly term.
I was just sort of kind of pondering the idea of like, well, like what is, you've got me thinking, what does simulationist actually mean? Because, some people go with that and it's like, oh, well, we're going off a historical record, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's how those things occurred, because you're looking at it in you're looking at it in reverse.
That's very true.
And you don't necessarily know what the decision-making or factors that drove that. I mean, there are some records of those things. But I feel that this game is trying to give the feeling of what it's like to control that kind of a force, rather than, as you say, what some people might refer to as simulationist, but it's not taking... I'm having a hard time describing this.
But I think I'm getting what you're saying, because it's like, by a lot of the times when we say simulationist, or when we say it in this specific context, we mean mostly, do things behave or are enforced to behave in ways that are perceived as historical, right?
Right, based on the outcome, though, right?
Yes.
I guess that's sort of the clincher, is that we're looking at what the outcome is. And so we might be building a game based around producing this sort of an outcome, as opposed to creating a system that generates more of how that army would function, and through abstraction, of course, right? Like,
yeah, and that's where it gets really interesting, because you're onto something. Like, there are a lot of games that are going to have a lot of specific things, like a Prussian formation must be like this and behave thusly. Lasalle doesn't get as constrained with that. There are army building restraints that you can use. There's lots of stuff in there that you can do to tailor this and make it as specific as you may want it to be. And there's like unit traits and all types of cool stuff. But you're not going to be in a position where like you're buying the traits that make the unit the thing that it is, or you're going to be restricted in using it in such a specific way as to know that it is only capable of such a thing. It's more on you as the divisional commander to utilize things in the way that you best see fit and employ these momentum points effectively. And that's pretty rewarding. I mean, like, you can make a lot of arguments that like a line battalion would know to form square or whatever. But this game perhaps games it up a bit, but makes it a meaningful choice moment. And what are games but meaningful decisions, right? Like that's like a huge part of them. So instead of making it a dice roll where you're like, oh man, on a 7 or higher on 2d6, these guys wake up. It's more like, am I smart enough to know that this is the time? I'm not smart enough, but you know what I mean? Like, am I knowing that this is the opportunity to spend my momentum to call that formation change? Or do I miss that because I'm focused on my cavalry right now and I completely miss your charge? I don't see it coming. So there's like, is that what makes it work? So my big question I want to pose is, when you're dealing with something like you're dealing with sci-fi or fantasy, it's almost like there's not as much to represent because it's not as grounded. So we don't know the reality of it as much. So we can't assign as many variables to track because we don't know what to track, so to speak. This can be argued against, but this is kind of the basic outline I'm making. Comparatively, a historical game gives you a much greater amount of information as to the nature of the conflict. I mean, if you want to go back to the Bronze Age, maybe that's not going to apply. But if we're talking the Napoleonic era, where we like literally have like the names of the brigadiers who fought at Waterloo, like we know who was there. You know, we understand a lot about how this works. Mm-hmm. My main question is, when you're looking at something that we know more about that isn't strictly coming from an imaginative space, we can base more on a certain reality. Like, if you want to make a World War II reference, we know the frontal armor and slope of a T-34, right? Is it more important to pin that down and represent that? Or is abstraction still as valuable and meaningful, even if you are rounding certain corners off, right? Like the skirmishing of this game.
I mean, that's a matter of design objectives. What are you trying to make? If you're trying to create something that simulates the data that we have about a particular type of warfare or a specific kind of battle, I mean, there's going to be gaps in that information anyway. So let's disabuse the idea that using historical documentation, no matter how, detailed it might be, is still possible to have gaps in that, or not necessarily misunderstandings, but to not fully understand how you get from point A to point B within one action versus its result.
That's true. Absolutely.
Right. So let's not make the fallacy of history that we understand exactly how those things. There's certain scales that we can set a game to work at that will mitigate that. There are certain abstractions that we can make, like this game does with various parts of how it operates. And every game is going to use some level of abstraction, right?
Yeah.
Because eventually you're just pulling up more and more needless detail, or you're over-designing your game. And again, this brings me back to, what are you building? The idea of creating a simulated battlefield with game mechanics that operate as such, at least in my opinion, is basically folly, because using game mechanics is an abstraction already.
Can I put it kind of tritely, like, is a game of toy soldiers bad?
So what is a game of toy soldiers like to you?
I would make the distinction, a game of toy soldiers being something that is like, it's comfortable rounding off the corners that it must to deliver the best play experience without consideration to a bullet point by bullet point representation of a specific understanding, not a specific reality per se, but a specific understanding of an event or context.
So it's basically, how do you want your game to feel? Lasalle is really kind of asking the question, does playing the game in a certain way, are you rendering a kind of experience from it by having this sense of this abstracted sense of distance and forward momentum? Is that the fun part of the game? Or is it having that totality of control that like a more traditional Napoleonic game would have, where, I'm moving this forward to engage with these pieces, and therefore I can see that moment to moment. I would argue that the more typical form that game takes is awfully omniscient.
Agreed. Yes.
And some of them make the effort to not to be less that way. I mean, the idea of including dice means that you don't have absolute control. And not to say that excluding randomness makes it more real, because it doesn't. Things aren't, warfare is not a math problem.
Truth.
Right? It doesn't work out that way. There are things, like there are odds that to say that this thing will affect that. By implicitly saying that there are odds means that there is a sense of randomness, right? Even if it's controlled. I mean, I always think the objective is to make a good game. So if having this different perspective is more fun, then I think it works for those people that find it to be so. If some people are taken aback by how different it is, I mean, that means that it must run against the tastes of whatever they think a Napoleonics game should be. And they're not so much the audience, unless, of course, they want to see that experience projected from a different rule set.
Yep. No, you're right.
Hopefully I'm not being too obscure to that.
No, I don't think so. Like, okay, when you want to play a Napoleonics game, you kind of are taking on a bunch of tradition in addition to the game itself. There's a long history of it being sort of the golden child, whatever that means, of the wargaming hobby. So there's a lot of expectations about how it's supposed to function, how we assume these things to work, because there's this idea that I don't agree with necessarily, well, at all, that we're not playing for fun. We're playing for a higher purpose. There's something more to me playing toy soldiers. So if it's merely a game of toy soldiers, well, then I'm doing a disservice to myself, and that's not enough. It must be a simulation. It must be greater than that. It's a con sim now,
Right, but then what is that? Why are you doing that? I guess this is a more deeper philosophical question, which is like, okay, so you're not playing for fun. I think that's a lie, first off. Yeah. Obviously, you're deriving enjoyment, because unless you're somehow being paid to do this.
Yeah, right. Unless you're like a staff officer.
Sure, yeah. If you're or if you're designing the game, but then if you're designing the game, you're ideally making it to appeal to people who are not you. Otherwise, it's going to be a very niche game. So fun is coming into this at some point or another, and that, or it is some kind of war game training exercise.
Right.
That's a totally different thing. Clearly, most of these games, these Napoleonic games, well, one, we don't fight war like that anymore. So what are you doing?
Right. Yep.
Then the other argument is, well, okay, it's for the purposes of historical understanding. I mean, what are your feelings on that? Like the idea that like, oh, well, I'm playing a historical game to, I don't know, better understand the history of that battle.
I do believe that. I do believe with the right mindset and understanding that it is going to give you limited information, but I do believe that you can gain context through these games. I mean, that's a bit of a lardy perspective, right? But like, I do have the idea that by playing Chain of Command, it does teach you that there is an inherent cost ratio to men to taking ground. Like it makes that math clear to you. Not to say, again, war is not math, but you know what I'm saying, right? It shows you that is like an undeniable thing, and it makes you contend with that strategically. And that's a lesson. It's not like, the way that it's depicted in cinema, or the way that sometimes a history book rounds the corners off and you only read about unit numbers and you don't hear about people anymore. It's like, this gives you sort of a perspective where you're like, oh, damn, that was like 3 guys from my rifle team, and you see that happen. It's just a game. Well, to show my colors, I guess, it is just a game, but it is in such a way that you can like take away a context or an opportunity to learn and have additional value. And it's almost like not even the game. It's more the research that the game will inspire you to do to make you do a better job at the game. That is still just a game, but the research is the real inherent value of this version of the overall hobby, because now you're just reading history books.
Well, yeah. And like, as I said, like one of the dangers you run for having a game that operates this, so it becomes this sort of cyclical thing where like you read history to then better play the game, which in a tabletop experience means that in some ways you're designing it.
Yeah.
because then you will be changing certain things. And thus it becomes this endless cycle, which in itself is a hobby.
Yes, indeed.
There's so many things about that because you're using something that isn't the thing itself to determine the results of the information that you're reading. Not to mention that the game rules then have to reflect this. So if you do something in the game that you historically know isn't accurate, it then becomes discretionary, right? And if you're playing with somebody else, now you have an argument between the person who says, well, I did this move, and the other person saying, well, that isn't historically accurate. And then it brings into question, well, what are we playing to do? Are we playing to better understand that thing? Or are we playing to better understand history? And I mean, there's a bigger question as to why do that in that way? Like, I'm not saying, like, to understand history is good. Like, I think that that's a noble pursuit for sure. But what makes doing this better or more effective than, say, reading and understanding like an academic might?
Right.
What greater understanding do you derive from this? I'm deeply suspicious of historical gamers when they get into this kind of thing. I do agree with you that, like, you can learn certain things about an experience through that, but it's only if those rule systems accurately reflect. Otherwise, you're just perpetuating a misconception that the rules may have done as a matter of convenience.
To align with your point, even, it's like, are the rules accurate, not to like a reality standard, but accurate to your readings?
Right.
So like, I've read these 7 out of 200 books. So like, I have a very certain perspective of how this type of conflict works in, say, Eastern Front, World War II. So when I play your game, you might have read 50 books that are totally different from my 7 books. So you might be more educated overall, but they don't align with my expectations. So I'm like, this game's garbage. It doesn't do any of the historical things. But it's just a matter of the readings that have informed the perspective that you take into the game experience.
So that's like a fidelity issue, right?
And I guess that's kind of my big question is, like, when you're dealing with a historical game, is a commitment to fidelity more of an expectation than in a comparable fantasy or sci-fi title?
I mean, I suppose the temptation of buying into that is greater with a historical game. I don't know if that necessitates that it must be like that, because people play chess, and that is in many ways a war game of sorts, but it's popular in the sense that it's abstracted and replayable. It has so many other things going, and it's not historical to anything. It's not even like, it's just a theme, essentially.
Yes.
But arguably it operates as a war game, and it's very finessed into the experience that it creates. It doesn't make it any less appealing.
Yeah.
But again, the people that play chess and the people that play like a historic war game are not the same people necessarily. For instance, if you were playing if you wanted to get pure strategy from a game, historic war game is a bad way to go.
Well, like, is a war game just a tactical puzzle that you have fun unraveling? Or is there other things you can glean from it, right? There's the whole social element of chilling with your buds. There's the artistic or hobby-based element of building, painting, gluing your fingers together, that stuff. But it's like, when we said, you know, like, some people feel like, oh, there's more to it than fun. It's like, is that something that's worth engaging with in the context of the historical hobby? Because what brings me back to the historical gaming, and I've really been back into it this year in a big way, has been the way that it's made me research and read things that I'm finding so interesting. Like, I'm not going to, you know, try and slag off fantasy and say, oh, those books are bad. But like, say you're going to play a Warhammer campaign. Like, what research are you going to do? You're going to read some Black Library novels? You know, it's like not the same thing to me.
Sure. Though, again, there's this idea that nothing exists in a vacuum. So in many ways, it is more speculative, but it is based on something that exists. So you can actually use history in a fantasy game.
No, that's a good point.
Much harder with a sci-fi game, depending on how projected into the future you're getting.
Yes.
But is understanding the internally consistent principles of something more important than understanding the way a thing plays out? And see, I think this is the trap that historic gamers kind of get themselves stuck into. At least the kind you're talking about, because some people play historic games and it's entirely speculative. But it leans more into the idea of that internal consistency, which is arguably what I would say is more controlled for in a fantasy game, because you're not bringing in all of these inconvenient truths, because there are no inconvenient truths necessarily. I mean, there are bad rolls and things like that, but
Yep.
you can know as much as you need to know because the rule game tells you exactly what you need to know. And you can then round that out with a knowledge of history comparable to that fantasy setting. And as you say, internal fiction that supports or adds exception to that.
Right.
History is real, but that certainty can come with a bit of a trap that because it's real and because of the things I'm reading must be true or at least accurate. Therefore, I am learning more about it. But like any kind of knowledge, one, it generates diminishing returns. So like if you're trying to find out how a system of battle works, how do you approach it? Do you approach it from, say, the weapons point of view or the tactical point of view? What part of it makes the difference? Where do you build your foundation? If you wanted to get really simulationist, you'd be like, well, we need to work out what the physical projection of a lead ball through space projected by burning black powder. That then leans into the fallacy that I can make a system accurate enough to build an accurate system. This is why things like GURPS and like the hero system aren't more popular, because it's just this obsessive level of detail that doesn't actually get me to understand whether I hit the guy or not. If you take it from the historical point of view, you also don't get very far because all you're doing is learning about command order formation, regiment culture, different aspects. And now you're operating under that and the end conclusion of whatever historical battle came to. So now you're divorced from reality. You're living a kind of cataloged form of reality, which is as much a fiction because it doesn't actually represent anything than what happened.
To support your point, like think about this. This is kind of what Sam says in the book as well. The author here, they make a point where me and you each have a car. I have a red car. You have a black car. I drive faster off the starting line than you. This is the only time we know about the red car versus a black car in this context historically. So does that mean red cars are faster? I mean, one time they were. So does that therefore mean that we should make red cars have a +3 to movement because that one time? Or was it the driver of red cars are better drivers inherently? Because, well, he's the driver of a red car, so he's the better type of driver. Like, there's these considerations that get baked in to the logic that wargamers bring to history. And I've read more than one history book that has gone out of their way to make fun of wargaming history fans.
I tend to want to call this particular subsect of wargamers historic gamers.
Yes, okay.
Right? Because wargamers, I mean, that's a huge thing. But historic gaming is almost like this obsessive goal to recreate the outcomes of a battle. I mean, sometimes just for the sake of itself.
I love a good historic campaign, but I'm less inspired by a historic refight. Does that make sense? Like, I would love to take the orders of battle of the 100 Days campaign, right? Like that's in Blucher, you can do this with the 100 Days expansion. And you just like start the campaign with the orders of battle that the belligerents had. And then the battles that happen are the ones that you bump into each other with, not the ones that are prescribed through history. And you're trying to see if you can A, match or B, not match that outcome.
Okay. So here's a question for you. So regarding the board game Axis and Allies, how fun is it to play over and over again?
Once you know how to crack France, like the game's over. I mean, you still can roll bad, but because it's solved. It's on the road to be that way because of the limited strategies.
So like the Axis can win, but it gets progressively harder as they play the game. And then compare that to, say, War of the Ring, where it's more gamist, right?
Yeah.
But those same advantages are built in, but they don't predetermine what will happen. Each side has its gambit that will, if they lean into it, will get them some amount of victory, but could backlash and destroy them. In the case of like the original Axis and Allies, like for one thing, don't play Japan.
True.
You'll just basically you'll basically lose.
You'll have a lot of fun with your fighters for a little while before eventually it all comes crashing down.
But as soon as you understand how that game is balanced and built, you realize that it is built to recreate World War II. And if you enjoy it in a moment-to-moment sense, yeah, it's fine. But you know what's going to happen at the end. And there is a possibility of breaking the odds. It's not an uncommon thing. But it isn't designed to do that. It's designed to recreate history, more or less. Is that fun? Maybe. I mean, at what level are you thinking? Like, well, if you want to win, no, it's not fun.
Truth, like there are ways to play historical games that are effectively just tactical games that look like historical games, right? Like that's a big thing. But I feel like you want a marriage of something that inspires not the truth of the matter, because that is elusive, right? We're not going to know. Well, we don't have time machines yet or ever. So simple as that. Like the thing that I find important, and again, this is sort of a Lardyism, I like doctrine, because we can't represent a lot of things, but we can look at what they were trained to do and then try and do that and see if it works. And if it fails, then you improvise and you do new things. Like, for example, the classic example I will come to is the 2-inch mortar with the late war British rifle platoon. In chain of command, you're deploying smoke, you're isolating enemy positions, and you're maneuvering with cover now. And like that is something that is informed by the historical doctrine of that platoon. So you're not like learning how to sight a mortar by any means, but like it's being instructive in the sense where you're learning like, oh, cool, this was an integral part of how this platoon operated and fought. And the way they would do that is kind of like blocking lines of sight and providing smoke screens. And there's a certain like logic that it informs to you. But you're absolutely right. If you believe that there is a truth to the matter that you can like chip away at and like see, oh my God, I've got to the gold underneath it all. I don't think that's real. I think what you're trying to do, in my opinion, is look for like what if possibilities. Like, wouldn't it have been neat if, or we don't know what happened here, so maybe it was this. I like that as opposed to this obsessive or fastidious obsession with trying to recreate something in such a way as you're like, hey, that did end the way it should have. And I'm glad we did that for 6 hours. Like, you know what I mean?
Well, that's the thing is I'm more interested, like for me personally, I'm more interested in games like as a thing in and of themselves. I'm also interested in history. I'm also interested in the history of games. So I have some perspective on how those things connect together. How do those rule sets and conventions take over and turn into other rule sets? I mean, for me, it's, doctrine, tactics, and technology.
Yeah.
Those are the things that I think you can represent, at least to some degree, and you can put them in a level of importance by looking at what they put emphasis on. And also, like, if you're looking at those reports, how does the opponent view?
Yeah, in opposition to it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, like, in almost every World War II game, there is some advantage given to German machine guns.
Yes, absolutely.
Practically a joke in how, like, ubiquitous that is. And that could just be a monkey see, monkey do kind of design.
Yep.
But if you look at some of the record, you do realize that, they had very, very effective machine gun tactics and also very effective and fast-firing machine guns.
Yeah, indeed.
The Germans put a lot of emphasis into this, which is a result of learning what their lessons learned from the First World War were. And then you have the Allies' perspective of machine gun nests. German machine gun nests are a hell of a thing to take out for X, Y, and Z reasons, right? So that's how I would make a parallel, as I would look at the history and I'd see, well, what was happening if I look at this? And then what was happening if I look at this? And is there a connection between those two things? Like, say, infantry movement and machine gun positioning. And you look at both sides and how they viewed that thing. And you try to create enough of a number of instances where you can create consensus. And from that consensus, you can create a ruling or an abstraction. And you're not going to be able to grasp every exception. Maybe at the table, there's an idea from house rules people are familiar with. So there's called rules, or like calls.
Oh, yeah.
And that basically means that, well, because this particular situation is set up, then I think it should have this effect. And then you would argue your point.
Yeah, very umpire-based.
It's a house rule in this specific spot. It works a lot better if you have a referee at your table.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it can turn into an endless shouting match if you're not careful.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's the thing. Now we're coming back to the idea of tabletop as difficult to call it an art form exactly, but like...
as an exercise.
Yeah. As a thing that is done, is that it's not bound to what the book tells you, whether that book is a rule book or a history book, right? Because you have your own experiences, one would hope a wide enough array of them if you're interested in a topic, and you don't base everything on theory or academic knowledge, and then it'd be some combination of those things. Sometimes you can glean very, very important things if you actually go out and do the thing. It's like, go shoot a gun.
Or try and shoot a bow and tell me that you could do anything Legolas has done. I know we've talked about this, but holy crap.
Right. And it's like, and also know that you are not a trained individual if you're going and doing that. Like, you don't make the assumption that oh man, it took me like forever to reload that musket. I'm like, yeah, but if you watch someone who's actually drill trained, you'll be like, oh wow, you can do that really quickly.
Yeah, 5 rounds rapid. What's going on?
Yeah, exactly. It's important to recognize what the boundaries and limitations of the thing you're playing are. And to go back to what we're talking about in this game, what is the thing you're trying to show, right? Like it's almost like you're trying to get a feeling and then work from that.
Yeah.
Like, as I said, like even in role-playing games, like when we were talking in our previous episode about Over the Edge, that game is trying to convey an experience that is not something that you could get from playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
Some people would argue you could have that experience played in Dungeons and Dragons, but I would argue that is not optimized, right? And that it may feel cumbersome because of fundamental things like levels and experience drawing the attention away from what's happening to how well I'm doing. And that doesn't mean that the mechanics of how well I'm doing don't have a place in a game, because obviously Dungeons and Dragons is a thing. But when you make a game, you're tailoring the experience to the game, right?
Yeah.
And that game does not necessarily have to represent reality. It can't. First, you have to set that limitation. When I was doing academic games and I was working for a professor of peacekeeping studies and I was trying to work this out, I had to explain to him that, like, he couldn't put everything into the scenario. It needed to be a very focused slice that taught how to do conflict resolution.
Yeah.
A lot of the frustration was explaining that it wasn't a simulation, because no matter how much you know, you can't know everything. So all you can do is focus as to what you are going to explain. And a game mechanics, though they are variable and they can have dynamic and procedural results, which can create surprising outcomes, they're still limited to those things that can happen. Those things that can happen, like how many different games of chess can be played. Like, it's not even like it's calculable, but it's like not anything that anyone will ever see. Right. So you're creating enough possibility space that the game is enjoyable and it has a lot of choices, and those choices feel and then you have a decision between accurate and fair.
Yeah.
And that's a tough one. And then there's also the experience that you're delivering on. And so in Lasalle, it's focused around this idea of, well, what does it feel to be in the command of this army from the position of the back line?
You're onto it, because you're not feeling like the lowest level officer. You're not even seeing their decisions. You're making your decisions and pushing them, like you said, pushing them out.
See, this is my whole criticism of like, oh, well, like that's not how the battle actually went. It's like, yeah, but you're jumping between like the frontline soldier's perspective and the commander's perspective, and sometimes holding those perspectives simultaneously. And I'm like, is that actually accurate? Like in Chain of Command with like command dice. It's like, well, it's a total abstraction. It's like, oh, well, I randomly rolled what I could tell what people to do. If you think about how that actually works out and what it actually feels like as reflective to real life, in those situations, that's kind of what it ends up being. Even if that's not how it happens, that's what ends up happening.
How do we achieve the pressure or the result that we want in the most satisfactory way that isn't pinned down by some misconception that we think we know what may have really happened, per se?
Yeah, because you're not going to know that.
And like to make 50 bullet points of like, well, in this case, do this. Oh, if it's a shaken battalion, do this. Well, in this case, if this battalion had epaulettes only on their left shoulders, make sure you do this. Like, that is insane. So I know what you mean. And like, because we're getting on time here, I do want to say like my takeaway from Lasalle is you're able to get the outcomes. You're able to get the experience. You're able to play a very satisfying and crunchy tactical Napoleonics game, but you can do it in 2 hours. You can do it without having to get 36 skirmisher bases. Oh my gosh. And you have meaningful interactions between yourself, your units, and your opposition through the momentum points. It drives this game.
And it sounds like a unique experience. And that's what I would look for as somebody who plays games.
Yeah, it doesn't just feel like a change of costumes, you know?
And because I know you can't convey everything in a single game, I want to play more games, right? Because I might get a different perspective that is also accurate, but obviously at the expense of some other aspect.
Yeah.
It's the idea of trying to find this perfect system that I think is not quite right.
There's no destination with the hobby. It is always a progress, a journey that you're going through to like you. I don't believe that you're going to lock down like, well, I finally found my game system of choice and I am never going to learn about a new game ever again. It's like, no, you will find what works for you and that will work for you for the duration of time that it does. And then perhaps you'll find something new. And you can't just like saying like, no, I'm never going to change these things because that's crazy.
So anyway, I think we've talked this one to death, and I think we've got into, well, I think a really interesting area. Hopefully we talked enough about the game. It's not a huge game per se. And, you know, like props to, I think the author laid it out himself, but it is very clear and very nicely laid out.
Great wording, excellent layout, great photos throughout. So big fan.
Yeah. So if you want a different experience in terms of Napoleonics, to parallel, you know, and like play this and play your other favorite, or if you've only ever played this, then try something else out and let us know what you think.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a big, wide world of games out there. I mean, part of the reason we wanted to make a podcast about games is because we knew it would nearly impossible to run out.
Absolutely. And I mean, when you want to look at some of the games that are out there, you can pick things that are, you know, in line with the Stoic tradition of a format of gaming, or you can find things that are, you know, a revision or a revolution in their own right. And I think Lasalle manages to do something that still feels very core Napoleonic, like you're still moving battalions for heck's sake, but it does this in such a way that it's very smart, it's elegant, and it still gives you a heck a lot of command friction to deal with without it grinding you to a halt. So I would say give this a shot, man, like for sure. We can do a game one day or something, but I would encourage our listeners to also give it a try if they haven't, because Blucher gets talked about. People really like Blucher, but Lasalle doesn't get the same reference. So I think it's worthy of the conversation. But we're going to be back next week. Max, you want to fill us in on what our next episode's going to be?
So it's our brand new start of a series called Tales of Lore, where we just explore the literary origin and sometimes film, whatever media origins of a game setting. We're going to try and make it a little different from like, because there's 1,001 lore channels out there. And I would love to get into specifics about any one of them. But we want to kind of also tie into the publishing history and something about how like that franchise came about. So yeah, I hope you enjoy our overview, which is going to cover the golden age of fantasy, i.e. the 1970s, and how we got from the old stuff, the prototypes, into what came after that. So please, by all means, come and check it out. And hopefully if you like it, we'll be doing more of those dives.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for listening, everyone. Happy gaming.
Happy gaming.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.